Hello, everybody. My name is Jason Grillo, Event Director for AirMiners, and I wanted to say welcome to the first in a series of AirMiners events focused on energy sources for carbon removal, and happy World Nuclear Energy Day. Today's discussion is about the possibility of using advanced nuclear energy to power carbon capture and sequestration as a climate solution at scale. Our moderator today for this discussion is Aldis Elversdotter, who studied environmental engineering at Harvard University and wrote a recent article about the intersection of advanced nuclear energy and carbon capture. I'll be coming on later on to give a couple of announcements. I recommend everyone go on mute so that we can have a good discussion. But with that, we will get started now with Aldis. So please.
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you AirMiners for having us all. We have three fantastic panelists today. Kirsty Gogan, co-founder at Energy for Humanity and a new NGO, TerraPraxis. We have Seaver Wong, climate and energy analyst at the Breakthrough Institute, and Cannon Bryan, chief financial officer at Terrestrial Energy. So the central question we're really looking to tackle in this conversation is, in this design space of possible climate solutions, why should we be focusing on this intersection between advanced nuclear energy technologies and the possibility of capturing carbon, storing it, sequestering it, or utilizing it? And what are our panelists' visions for how this might play out at scale? So I'll have Kirsty start us off here in answering the first framing question of, what are the advantages of advanced nuclear energy technologies compared to other energy sources? And why should we start to consider using it for this particular CCS application?
Awesome. Well, thanks, Aldis, and thanks, AirMiners. This is so awesome to see this intersection of direct air capture, carbon removal with nuclear energy. So I'm pretty excited about it. And you know, I haven't always been pro-nuclear, and one of the things as an environmentalist that really appealed to me about nuclear technology is the power density. It's incredibly dense, like 1,000,000 times more dense than coal. And that means that you can have an awful lot of power with a very, very small amount of land use. And that's going to become, I think, increasingly important with our climate challenge, because not only do we have to replace our entire fossil fuel infrastructure within incredibly challenging timescales, and also maybe double or triple it to meet rising global energy demand. Even if we succeed in getting to that zero by mid-century, which, let's be honest, is mind-bogglingly unlikely that we'll get to zero, even if we get to zero, we're still going to have enough CO2 in the atmosphere by 2050 that we're going to need to be removing an additional 10 to 20 gigatons per year between 2050 and 2100. And just to give you a sense of how much that might be in terms of energy use, we'd say that you could remove about 10 gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere per year with around 300 gigawatts of baseload energy, right? So that's just a kind of rough approximation. Curious if people have different view on that. So let's say that we don't get all the way to zero and we only get to 75%. We could be removing like 40 gigatons. We could be talking about really, really large amounts of carbon removal between 2050 and 2100. So when you start to think about that and you think about the scale of the infrastructure challenge that we face, because that's really what this clean energy transition is, it's about building new infrastructure. Land use is going to become incredibly important. And then the other piece I think that's really relevant to this discussion is the combination of heat and power. Nuclear energy has very particular attributes that it's possible to make very large amounts, very low cost power with a very high capacity factor, which means it generates a lot of the time, maybe 90% plus of its installed capacity. And when you combine that with the production of thermal energy, of heat, whether it's low temperature heat or high temperature heat, that combination is really, really useful when it comes to carbon removal. So that's why I think we should really pay attention to this technology for this application.
Wonderful. I'd love to hear Cannon and Seaver's thoughts following on to this. So we have that heat cogeneration, the land area, high energy density, and this huge value proposition of using this as a role in decarbonization. So Ken and Siver, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Elise. Just to follow on what Kirsty has said, my observation is that carbon removal and carbon processing, potentially processing that CO2 into something useful, requires an awful lot of energy. And I've actually got an example ready with me here. Just looking at Carbon Engineering, which is a Canadian company doing direct air capture, they have written in a paper that they released a couple of years ago that they need about 14 gigajoules of energy, both heat and electric power, to make 1 ton of CO2. So that is an awful lot of power. And just to put that into context, if you wanted to take that carbon and use it to make, let's say, synthetic or sustainable aviation fuel, 3 billion liters of sustainable aviation fuel, you would probably need about 3.9 gigawatts of capacity, of energy capacity of production. So that's huge. That's a lot of energy. Now there are other ways of captured carbon, and there, and I'm sure maybe Carbon Engineering will continue to improve their processes and make them more efficient. But the point is, it's a lot of energy, and so the beauty of the next generation of nuclear systems that are being deployed or that are being developed now is that they are mostly high temperature systems, which is different from the conventional nuclear systems that are low temperature systems. And the other great thing is that they're scalable and low cost. So that really potentially makes them tremendously relevant solutions for integrating into carbon removal and not unimportantly into carbon utilization.
Wonderful. And Siver?
Yeah, I mean, I think Cannon and Kirsty both brought up the good points around heat, and I just want to add that as far as the heat requirements for carbon capture, the heat to power ratio of most direct air capture systems is actually on the order of 4 to 1. So you actually need a lot of heat for many direct air capture techniques. And granted, there are some that are high temperature, low temperature. But the heat requirement is important, and you obviously don't organically get heat from a wind farm or a solar farm. And so that advantage from a nuclear standpoint is significant. The second important advantage that nuclear presents actually is one that's a little underemphasized, which is advantages in terms of flexible siting. Because obviously you would have to site wind or solar where the resource potential is greatest, but that may not necessarily correspond with where the right sequestration sites are, with where your CO2 transportation pipelines are, with where your synthetic fuels factory is. With something like a small modular nuclear power plant, you would be able to site that much more flexibly to efficiently suit your sort of needs, and that has economic advantages, that has efficiency advantages.
All right. So a couple of points came up here, and I'm curious to ask each of you in turn a little bit more about how nuclear could play into each of the opportunities of capturing the carbon, storing it, sequestering it, or utilizing it, as Cannon mentioned. And so I would love to hear each of your thoughts on, what does nuclear power do that makes each of these an even better option for us? So maybe Siver, you could explain a little bit of the key considerations when we're talking about the difference between utilizing versus storing the captured carbon.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first in either case, you want first in either case, direct air capture, you really want to try and maintain a high uptime, a high capacity factor as well, something in excess of 80%. And so that really pairs well with the constant, clean, reliable baseload energy source that is nuclear. I will say one thing, as far as the balance between carbon sequestration and carbon utilization, one thing to consider is that you would need a stronger policy environment to incentivize carbon sequestration versus carbon utilization, where you're potentially turning that carbon into a marketable product. And I tend to subscribe to the David Keith school of thinking, where you would want to create a product with that carbon that has particularly high value to really maximize the economics of that carbon capture and utilization. So something like synthetic jet fuels. And so when you contrast that to carbon sequestration, where you really would need a very strong policy incentive to take that carbon and just put it underground without using it, I really think that makes a strong case for trying to find a creative ways to use that carbon, whether it's synthetic jet fuels, whether it's carbon fibers, that improves the economics of carbon capture and creates more of a potential for the technology to scale without needing necessarily sort of strong policy support.
All right. And perhaps Cannon can continue on this line of synthetic aviation fuel and how nuclear would make this very huge solution potentially.
Sure. Well, yeah. I mean, I think carbon products represent the potential for an entirely new market for nuclear energy. Like, nuclear energy has traditionally been constrained to the province of electric power generation, and that's been fine, and maybe a little bit of desalination. But you know, these types of industrial products and industrial manufacturing represent new markets for the next generation of nuclear technology that are as I said before, high temperature systems and scalable systems. So sustainable aviation fuel is a great one. It's getting a lot of attention nowadays. It's currently made over 95%, maybe over 99% of it is made out of bio-waste, which I personally don't consider carbon neutral. People are free to debate me on that. So I think in order to have a benevolent, a truly benevolent fuel in a closed cycle, you need to engage carbon capture and again, just touching on the comments that I made previously, you need to have a big energy source that's going to be low cost and scalable. So yeah, hydrogen is a tremendous energy carrier, and carbon is one of the most brilliant carrier elements for hydrogen, and storage mediums and transfer mediums for the energy which is inside of a hydrogen atom. So why not use the carbon in the atmosphere to be that carrier medium and create clean fuels? It's both creating a new life for next generation nuclear and also doing a public service at the same time and making profit for everybody involved. So I think it's a benevolent cycle potentially.
Pretty brilliant. And Kirsty, I would love to hear your thoughts on how this nuclear power can really truly decarbonize these fossil fuel heavy sectors with the combination in these various end uses.
Yeah, thanks. Well, so I want to make a sort of statement here, which is we have to go negative, not neutral. Okay, so it's considered responsible now to sort of buy enough renewable energy to offset your energy use, and yeah, we all try to be neutral, but it ain't good enough. We're going to have to take responsibility for the carbon that's already in the atmosphere and go negative. And that means that increasingly we're going to need to start thinking about how to be carbon negative in all of our activities. Now, here's a couple of ways in which we could already do that, right? So let's say, for example, Diablo Canyon, that nuclear plant that's slated to be closed in California soon, that's maybe close to some of your hearts, if you live in California. If that was being, if the waste heat from that plant was being combined with electricity production, you could be removing 20 million tons per year of carbon from the atmosphere. Because right now what's happening is that these big gigawatt scale depreciated assets, they're making baseload, clean, emissions-free power, but you're just throwing away the heat, right? So, all of those nuclear plants, could be more useful, making more of a contribution towards that responsibility that we all have to go negative. And here's another example. We're publishing a report in January that was commissioned by the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, on innovative deployment models for advanced high temperature reactors. And we were just sort of doing a little bit of a teaser webinar about this today at a webinar co-hosted with the Clean Air Task Force. So I can share with you what we told everybody, and that's an offshore, so a sort of production platform akin to the kind of thing that you see in the oil and gas sector with high temperature reactors making hydrogen, but then also taking limestone, extracting the carbon from the limestone to make synthetic jet fuel. Now, the synthetic jet fuel that's made according to our techno-economic assessments will be cheaper than jet fuel is today. But the really fun part is that when you take away the leftover lime and disperse it in the ocean, it soaks up 1.8 molecules of carbon from the ocean. So you're deacidifying the ocean, you're decarbonizing the biosphere, and you have carbon negative jet fuel. So that's a kind of a nice example of how you can apply these technologies in really innovative and interesting ways. And that's before we get started even talking about all of the very, very many applications for hydrogen really as a feedstock. So long as you can make it cheaply enough, cleanly enough, and at a large enough scale as a feedstock for substitute fuels that can be, really rapidly decarbonizing, really tough to decarbonize sectors otherwise.
That's brilliant. I love this. And I see so many co-benefits that you're all talking about. And a couple aspects that I think we can maybe dive into in turn in terms of the design of the combination of these systems, how much it'll cost, how soon we can implement them. So many questions, where, who's involved. So let's just go through them one at a time. What are some design considerations when we're thinking about how to pair these maybe modular systems or scaled up systems with CCS and carbon utilization? Would either system need to adapt to suit the other? Do any examples exist of us already using nuclear power to power this operation? Kirsty, perhaps you can pick up and continue.
Well, so I'm not really an expert on CCUS, so I'm going to trust that Siva and Cannon know much more about this. But one thing I will tell you is that really what counts is cost. And that's really about the deployment model and the delivery model. Because what we really care about when we're talking about climate solutions is climate scale. Okay, so we need to really be thinking at the scale that the current oil and gas industries, for example, operate at, what the shipping industry currently operates at. If the shipping industry was a country, it would be the 5th largest economy in terms of the amount of emissions, right? So these are really, really large scale industries. So what we should be thinking about is leveraging those industries, leveraging the oil and gas sector, leveraging the shipping industry and the industrial capability and the very high productivity, very high quality manufacturing environments that we see in shipyards, for example, in order to start producing these solutions, these new technology configurations at scale, at a very low cost, and with a very rapid rate of deployment.
Siva, you must have some thoughts about tapping into this combination of industries.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I'll even make a statement a little stronger than Kirsty maybe, which is that yeah, honestly, the fact of the matter is that for carbon capture, you are going to have to rely on the expertise, the infrastructure, the technologies that the oil and gas sector have pioneered. If you're storing that carbon, then you're using drilling technologies. If you're transporting that carbon, then you're going to require pipeline infrastructure. If you're combining that captured carbon with hydrolyzed hydrogen to create all sorts of fuels, then you're going to need you're going to need new refineries. You're going to need knowledge of those chemical techniques. So really, no matter how you slice it, carbon capture is going to play an important role in decarbonizing industries, in potentially mitigating climate damages. So we know we're going to need this, and so we know we're going to need these related infrastructures and technologies. And so really, you have to one has to come to terms with the fact that, funnily enough, the problem that we find ourselves in, the industry that sort of has contributed to these problems also has some of the solutions that are needed. And so I think I actually think that's kind of exciting, and it's really a realization that we need to come to in terms of planning going forward.
But we're going to be using a completely different fuel source to power this decarbonization. And perhaps, Cannon, you can provide some perspective on how the modular systems that you've been developing with terrestrial energy might play a role in some of these actual operations.
Sure, yeah, and it's important to note that there's a lot of variation in different nuclear technologies, but there are some overlaps too. So I can speak to terrestrial energy's design as a case study. Our system uses a liquid uranium fluoride fuel that operates at high temperature. So it has a couple of pretty important commercial and industrial ramifications. One is that we can use regular old off-the-shelf balance of plant infrastructure. So in other words, the gear that you use to convert the heat from a heat source into electricity, it's called balance of plant infrastructure. And we can use the standard off-the-shelf stuff, which is really quite different for nuclear energy. The conventional nuclear energy has to have all kinds of specialized gear. So, but the other important thing to note is that balance of plant infrastructure in our system, in any way, actually forms quite a large fraction of the total capital cost. So if we are using our system just to produce heat that can be used in chemical processing of carbon capture, or formulating that carbon into something else, some kind of an industrial product, then we may be able to avoid the considerable capital costs of having that balance of plant infrastructure, or at least if we need to have a little bit of electricity, and we can have a system which is producing mostly heat, which is being used for chemical processing, and then a little bit of electricity, and those capital costs are pretty scalable too. So you can ultimately have a capital cost which is greatly decreased when used in that application. So I think that's pretty important.
All right, yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the cost. Thinking at scale, or for one of these systems, how much will it cost to roll out this combination of nuclear and carbon capture? What are some of the drivers that we need to consider? Perhaps, Cannon, you can continue along this line.
Okay, well, the biggest cost driver for hydrogen production is energy. And the biggest cost driver for carbon production is energy. So it's obviously pretty important where that energy is coming from and how that energy is made and what it costs. So it is our belief system and our business thesis that these next generation nuclear systems will provide a superior cost structure for these types of industrial applications. And again, it's so critical that those energy costs are low, because that is the enabling factor for doing not only carbon capture but carbon utilization. And I mean, so let's use sustainable aviation fuel as an example. if you're going to use nuclear or any other kind of chemical process for making aviation fuel other than using fossil fuels, the critical thing is it has to be cheaper than fossil fuels. Otherwise, why bother, right? So that is something that's being looked at now, and I think there's a pretty good chance that these next generation systems will have the capability of making these fuels cheaper than their fossil fuel counterparts. So I mean that's obviously very promising for a future world without flight shaming, where we can have lots and lots of sustainable aviation fuel that's truly sustainable and that has, again, I go back to it, a benevolent carbon cycle with the atmosphere.
Absolutely. I love that idea. Kirsty, do you have any follow-on thoughts?
I sure do.
Cost drivers.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite topics, actually. Thank you for asking. I mean, we need low costs for two reasons. Firstly, because if we assume people are going to pay more, all we're doing really is piling risk onto the, of failing to decarbonize in time, because it won't be acceptable or it'll cost too much. And also because actually we need such a rapid transition that, like Canon was saying, you have to create the kind of business incentives. So I want to talk about cost in two ways. First of all, in terms of the delivery of projects and what the cost drivers are there, but also then the drivers of hydrogen production costs, because we've done a lot of work on both of those things. And the missing link report that I just put into the chat focuses a lot on the drivers of cost for clean hydrogen production. So first of all, the pathway to low cost. We published a study on for the Energy Technologies Institute called the Nuclear Cost Drivers Study. And we surveyed the 30 most recently built nuclear plants around the world. And there's a really big range of costs. It's surprising. We tend to think that nuclear is expensive and slow because we kind of focus on the projects that are immediate in the United States and in Europe. And those are first of a kind, first in a generation projects that have required a really big investment to establish skills and capability within the supply chain, the labor force, the project leadership teams, and the regulator. And those projects, frankly, have not been optimized. She said, that's British understatement, by the way, for low costs. So they started construction without a completed design, which is like the #1 way in which you can make a major infrastructure project really expensive and delayed, especially when you have a highly complex, highly regulated project like a nuclear project with the regulator getting involved somewhere in the middle. And the whole thing is very explainable, and it's really hasn't got anything to do with the fact that it's nuclear. It's everything to do with a big, complex, highly regulated infrastructure project. So you can very quickly get to very substantial cost reductions, even in conventional gigawatt scale nuclear plants. And that's actually the majority of what we see around the world today. The majority of nuclear plants around the world today are being delivered for less than $4,000 a kilowatt. So, really quite cost competitive scheduling and so on. But then if you move away from the sort of low productivity traditional construction approach to a high productivity manufacturing environment, standardized products designed for manufacture and assembly, designed for reuse, so you don't redesign your product every time, very high productivity manufacturing and delivery, you end up with really short construction schedules, a lot of certainty around budget and schedule, and ultimately very optimized outcomes, as you'd expect to see with any standardized manufactured product. So that's the first thing to say, that's the kind of end of the product line that we want to be in. And then just very briefly on what drives the costs of hydrogen, what we have found in our evaluations of all of the clean production options is that capacity factors really are the big deal, because you're using your electrolyzer equipment to its maximum capability as well, capacity as well. So even though we expect to see very dramatic, reductions in capital costs of wind and solar, and reductions in capital costs of electrolyzers and increased efficiencies of electrolyzers, we still see nuclear technology as performing the best in terms of cost outcomes for hydrogen because of that very high capacity factor, especially when you combine it with the high temperature applications as well. And then of course you can also, because of the very small environmental footprint, achieve the scale that's relevant for these global commodities markets.
All right. Siva, any thoughts to add here? Also probably tying it into the timeline. So given that these costs are starting to become cost competitive, how close are we to actually implementing this solution?
Well, it's difficult to predict the future, but I think this is going to be a very exciting decade. Yeah, Kirsty's talked about how not all of the cost issues related to nuclear have anything to do with the fact that it's nuclear, and how advanced reactors have the potential to really drive costs down further in a revolutionary way. On the hydrogen front, there's a lot of work being done on the innovation side into making hydrolysis of hydrogen, hydrogen production through hydrolysis more economical. And then similarly, direct air capture, it really sort of blew people's minds when David Keith put out that recent study, announcing that the cost of carbon capture had gone down to somewhere around the order of $90 to $300 of dollars per ton of carbon captured, and we can drive that down even further. And so I mean, again, it's difficult to predict when exactly DACTA fuels, for example, would become cost competitive with conventionally produced fossil fuels. But it's definitely fair to say that these are sectors in which technological progress is moving very quickly, and there are ample opportunities, from whether it's government or private, to further accelerate that process of innovation, pilot programs, and deployment.
Wonderful. Yes. And perhaps, Canon, you can give us a timeline of when we might start to see the systems that terrestrial energy is developing.
Sure. Let me just provide some context. In terms of next generation nuclear, the world's first next generation nuclear plant is already operating. It was commissioned in 2017 in Russia. It's called the BN800. It's a next generation nuclear system. There is a wave of next generation nuclear technologies that are being commercialized in this decade, in the 2020s, terrestrial energy among them. And I think the plan is, certainly for terrestrial energy, is to provide that commercial proof to the global marketplace, to show that we can make these systems at the low cost that we claimed we could. And once we do that, and once real actual electric utility companies have made those investments and shown that these things are constructible and licensable, then there will be, I believe there will be a rush of demand for these systems, particularly as we continue to see that the alternatives are not going to be sufficient to solve our energy problems. So I think the commercial proofs will be provided in the 2020s, and broad global deployment at great scale would be starting in the 2030s. And while we're doing these commercial proofs, the technology developers can also start working on their order books and start getting those orders for those power plants, whether they be for electric power or some other kind of industrial power. That process can start today. It doesn't have to wait until the first plants are commissioned. So that will also accelerate the deployment that we need to see in the 2030s. In terms of the integrating nuclear systems with carbon capture or other chemical processing systems, I don't believe that there is a technological barrier there. Those systems already use heat, process heat, and to get that same process heat from a different source does not represent a technological uncertainty. So once the nuclear systems are proven and ready to go, they can be integrated as quickly as you want.
Yeah, let's talk about that integration and scale for a bit. I know that we're coming close to the 35-minute mark for the panel discussion. So after we talk about some of the location and the scale and who might be involved in the decision making, then let's turn it over to some audience questions. So perhaps, Kirsty, you have some thoughts and perspective on, where would we best be able to implement nuclear power plus carbon capture? And at what scale are we talking? You mentioned gigatons and energy usage in the beginning. So thoughts here?
Well, yeah, that's. I think there needs to be a study on this, I would say, to answer this question, thoroughly. But for example, the next gigawatt scale nuclear plant that's being planned in the UK, 3.2 gigawatts at Sizewell C, which is going to be the sort of second of a kind plant, light water reactor built in the UK, where we'd expect to see really substantial cost reduction, at least 30% from the first of a kind. The team that are developing that project are thinking really creatively and proposing the potential for direct air capture as part of their sort of reorienting, big baseload nuclear, much more towards a broader, low carbon energy services value proposition, where you could potentially be using the waste heat. I say waste heat. Why waste it? For direct air capture. So that would be low temperature direct air capture. But equally, you could be directing that heat for industrial, directly for industrial use, or indeed for the production of hydrogen or synthetic fuels. So we could start this today, and I think it would be worth exploring the potential for our existing fleet that are struggling economically in the United States right now in the electricity markets to diversify their energy services value proposition, including towards making this contribution towards carbon negative energy services. And then, as Canon was saying, we have this very broad range of new products that are being commercialized now, that are coming to market, that will have a really broad range of value, that were designed for a very broad range of market applications, and designed to be easier to buy, easier to site, easier to license, easier to build, maintain, and operate. Some very, very different value proposition to the sort of longer term gigawatt scale nuclear, the grandfather's technology that we're used to today.
Yes, these are exciting times, and I'm wondering if Siver and Kenan have some follow-up thoughts on location, scale, and stakeholders, how we make this happen.
I can make a quick comment on that. I mean, in terms of the cost of carbon, you can sort of look at it as I come from the natural resource space, which is mining and energy, and whenever you're looking at the economics of a mining project, you're looking at the grade. What's the grade? How many parts per million? And obviously, the higher the grade, pretty good chance it's going to translate into a lower cost to mine. So you want to look at the highest grade sources of carbon today, which are smokestacks, and then probably about the lowest grade is direct air capture, so roughly 400 parts per million, right, of CO2. So that would be, at the moment, the most expensive way of getting the carbon. I think those technologies are getting more and more efficient, and more and more cost effective as time goes by. But for the time being, I think probably the first examples of integrated systems are probably going to have to be linked to smokestacks. So emissions from a cement plant are the best. That has shown in some studies that were done to be the lowest cost way of making synthetic fuels, for example. So those initial sites would probably have to take that into consideration. But then once we get the carbon direct air capture, or those types of systems to be cost effective enough, then obviously the siting becomes irrelevant. You can put them wherever you want.
Siver, any closing thoughts as we move into audience questions on where we can implement this and who should be involved?
Sure. And then there was that third part of your question related to scale, which I
Scale.
actually have a little bit to
yes,
say
please.
on. Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add on location. I mean, it's going to come down to a balance of lowest cost energy, proximity to like optimizing for where you're capturing the carbon from, and also proximity to existing like hydrocarbon distribution networks if you're making fuels, et cetera. So that comes down to the application, the technology. I do want to make a point on scale, which is just when we're talking about carbon capture, it's easy to lose sight of like just how large the problem is. So say we want to capture 1/4 of current global fossil fuel CO2 emissions. So that'd be on the order of like 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. If anyone is familiar with like the battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, 70,000 tons of weight, capturing 1/4 of human CO2 emissions would require capturing a mass of carbon equivalent to 35,000 of these 70,000 ton battleships per year. So for comparison, 10 gigatons of CO2 per year is 1/4 of human CO2 emissions. Global steel production is around 1.9 gigatons of steel per year. So this is a large problem, and I don't want to minimize that. I certainly could envision and find a vision of the future very appealing, in which in the second half of the century, from 2050 to 2100, human society is very affluent, and we decide that this is something we want to do. This is something we want to do at scale. This is something that we want to devote the resources to minimize those climate damages. Is something, and maybe we decide that we want to do it. I do want to point out that it is a sizable logistical challenge. A paper in February of 2020, February of this year, estimated, for instance, that current estimates as far as geological storage of carbon, we could maybe store 200 gigatons of carbon given current rates of exploration. I think there's a lot more out there, but there's a little bit of work that has to be done here, and I don't want to minimize that. The scale is large.
Could I just quickly
yes, please.
Thanks, because I just sort of riffing on that, what Siver was saying. The thing about sort of location, I think, is really key here. So when you're talking about nuclear plants generally, you have to locate your nuclear plants, tethered to the transmission line, and a 30-year power purchase agreement that sort of constrains the location of your project, because you need the transmission, but also the size of your project, because it depends on the size of the market the electricity market that you're serving. So when you start thinking about applications for nuclear technology that are outside the power sector, that are, for example, for direct air capture or hydrogen production, synthetic fuels production, you start talking about commodities markets. And then you're no longer constrained in where you locate those projects. Now, if you are sequestering, obviously, then you need CO2 pipelines potentially. It really depends on the utilization of the carbon. That could be a limiting factor. But you could potentially have very, very large scale projects. We have a concept in our missing link to a livable climate report called a hydrogen gigafactory, where you have 36 high temperature reactors co-located on a refinery scale site, because actually what we're talking about here is refinery scale fuels production of commodities that are storable, transportable, and exportable to global markets. So 10 of those gigafactories would produce enough hydrogen to completely replace the UK's current oil use, for example, with a very tiny footprint.
Wow, that would be great.
Well, it really changes the economics for advanced reactor companies in particular, that need a pipeline of orders in order to kind of be able to justify the capital investment in the manufacturing facility, in the factory, in other words. If you've only got an order to buy one or two of those things, then you don't get the economy of scale to justify the investment in the manufacturing capability. So being able to build larger scale projects, it could be really transformative for the potential market for these products.
All right. Well, I think we're ready to address some audience questions in the last 15 minutes of the call. So some interesting ones have come in on fusion. What are our panelists' thoughts on the timeline for fusion and how that might play into CCUS? Who would like to take this one?
Well, in the UK, we're currently consulting on potential siting for our first fusion project. That was just announced this week. I think it's nearer, nearer than you think.
All right. And any thoughts about, let's see, what do current folks think about nuclear to 2028, advanced nuclear starting in 2028, and commercial fusion in the 2035 to 2040 timeframe? Does that sound reasonable to the smart people on this call?
I mean, the companies that are developing fusion technologies, they certainly have the capability of publishing their commercialization dates. I mean, I can say, from Terrestrial Energy's point of view, there is a day on a calendar that we can point to and say, that is the day that we will have a commercial operating power plant. I can even tell you the minute. So as far as I've seen, and I've done a lot of, I cover the space intensely, so I can tell you that my observation is that the fusion companies have not published commercialization date, with the exception of the ITER project, who said that they would be commercial in 2072. But I certainly hope that Kirsty's right, and that's going to be sooner than we think. I wish the fusion companies would give us more insight into their commercialization timelines.
All right. Siver, any thoughts on this? Otherwise, there's a question that could perhaps be directed to you, which is that, has anybody modeled out the dollar per sequestered ton of carbon via nuclear powered DAC, for example, with Climeworks or carbon engineering? Obviously, the inputs have significant uncertainty, but agreed, we all need to go negative.
No further thoughts on fusion. I share Canon and Kirsty's hopes that it's closer than we think, but it's not close enough that I've devoted any attention to it. On the second point, I know that work has been done on comparing costs of DAC under different using different energy sources, and they've looked at carbon intensity as well. But I don't know those numbers off the top of my head.
Fair enough. All right, there's a question about, for Canon, whether your system can run off of current waste streams from existing nuclear plants by virtue of running as a liquid fuel as opposed to ceramics.
Yeah, so definitely having a liquid fuel creates a scenario whereby processing of spent fuel becomes much easier than the processing of solid fuels. I think most anybody with a high school chemistry education could probably come to that conclusion. Terrestrial Energy, I can only speak for Terrestrial Energy. We have a plan to build our first commercial power plant, which does not include the reprocessing of fuel, because there's no regulatory pathway for that. But certainly the grand vision is that there's, from a technological point of view, we definitely have the capability of not only consuming our own spent fuel down to virtually nothing or virtually no long-lived waste, but we also, in fact, do have the capability of processing other waste from other nuclear power plants. That's the long-term vision. We have to create the regulatory pathways for that. But once that happens, I think what you're going to see is that the recognition, the global recognition that the value that is embedded in that waste is so immense that industry is going to pursue it quite aggressively, actually. And the regulatory barriers that exist, they're going to observe that they exist for no particularly good reason. Certainly not. There's no big safety arguments you can make for not processing waste. So, or even proliferation. There is no civilian nuclear energy program ever that has weaponized their nuclear fuel or their nuclear waste. So once industry picks up on this, on how valuable that spent fuel is, particularly in next generation systems like ours, it's just going to be, the whole concept of nuclear waste will be forgotten. The whole issue will be, 20 years from now, no one will talk about nuclear waste. It just won't be discussed. It won't be an issue.
Let's talk about, fuel banks that we're storing our spent fuel in. I think there hasn't really been a kind of economic driver because uranium's been so cheap and fuel is, a marginal cost. So there hasn't really been the kind of business incentive to look seriously at that. And in the UK, for example, the spent fuel that we're currently storing and classifying as waste contains enough energy to power the entire country, all of our energy needs for like 1,000 years. So I think you're absolutely right, Kenan.
I think the number that I heard was that the spent fuel resident in the UK today is worth more than all the reserves in the North Sea.
We have a lot of plutonium. Sorry about that.
So, but the value of that, it's extraordinary.
Yes, it's
like whoever heard of taking that value and just shoving it down a hole? It's absurd on its face.
Amazing. All right. So just to wrap up this wonderful conversation, we hear there's bipartisan support in Congress for both nuclear and carbon capture, utilization, and storage. How can we leverage this support? And perhaps how can audience members get involved in learning more about this? Just one last round robin, and then I'll hand it back to Jason and Tito.
I'll jump in, I guess. Yes, not just bipartisan support. There are drafted bills on the floor of Congress with bipartisan backing that would increase funding for research into carbon capture, that would increase funding for ARPA-E, that would increase funding for nuclear innovation, and so it's really it's actually one of perhaps the most powerful avenues in which we might actually see climate policy being enacted in the new administration and in a new Congress, because with the margins are going to be thin as far as a democratic advancing a democratic agenda goes. The margin is going to be quite thin in the Senate, no matter how the Georgia runoffs go, and so bipartisan support for legislation to advance energy technologies is really going to be one of the most likely ways that we're going to see sort of movement on U.S. climate policy in the next, at least in the next until the next major election cycle.
All right. Kirsty and Cannon?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Cannon.
Oh, I'll have a quick go at it. I mean, the adoption of these energy technologies, I'm just going to offer, they're supported by data. So if there are political constraints to supporting these new energy technologies, that they're not supported by data, which means by default they're supported by faith, faith-based ideas based on fears, unfounded fears, unsupported fears, unsupported by data. So I think what this is really going to be ultimately is a war of attrition. We have to stamp out the irrational fears, door to door, person to person. I can only say to the people that are on this call, I'm not afraid of nuclear energy. at all. Kirsty's not afraid of nuclear energy. And if you're afraid of nuclear energy, feel free to call on us and ask us, how are you able to overcome that fear? And we'll tell you, we'll walk you through it. And if you know someone else who has an irrational fear of nuclear energy, have them call upon us or someone else who's in the nuclear energy industry that can walk them through it. And that is how I think policy will finally go towards where the data is supporting it, and not just some weird faith-based belief systems.
Kirsty, final thoughts?
Yeah, thanks. Well, so the truth is, right, we're not on track here, okay? We're like on a 4-degree of warming trajectory by 2050. So I see this as having two really kind of critical opportunities. Firstly, if we can apply the same commitment and creativity to nuclear technology as we have done successfully for renewables, then we can use that technology to support our decarbonization, efforts for parts of the problem for which really we don't have good answers right now, and that's why we're on a 4-degree trajectory. So that's the first thing. So let's look at those parts of the problem, like coal and liquid fuels and carbon removal, and see if we can apply those very valuable attributes usefully in a low-cost way at scale and very fast. But the other really important piece, I would say, is that we could build bridges here. You know, we can address the polarization in the country and around the world, and the opposition and the fear and the insecurity that people are facing with this clean energy transition. You know, nuclear technology, if we apply it really well, could help to support, you know, sustaining jobs, sustaining industries. If this is really an opportunity to leverage all of that skills and expertise that we see in the oil and gas sectors that are currently threatened by the clean energy transition, and actually find a way out, find a way that protects those jobs and those that economic activity when we need it most, you know. And unless we can build those bridges to those communities, reach out our hands and say, let's actually find a solution together that meets all of our interests, but without emissions, then, you know, I think we need that in this post-COVID era.
That is such a wonderful closing thought. I just want to give a final thanks to all of you, our panelists, Kirsty, Seaver, and Cannon. Thank you so much for joining this event. And I'll hand it back to Jason and Tito.
Great, Elise. And thank you for excellent work moderating our session today. Thank you to Cannon, Seaver, Kirsty, also to Tito for support in this endeavor, also to our partners at the Anthropocene Institute and to EarthX, on which we're going to be rebroadcasting our event today. So we have a couple of announcements before we conclude here. Be sure to hang on for the post-networking session for the next 15 or 20 minutes after we conclude today. But before we go any further, I want to provide a floor space for Frank Ling from the Anthropocene Institute for an announcement. Frank?
Yes, Jason, Tito, thank you so much for organizing this event. And Aldis, a great job on moderating, and Cannon, Seaver, Kirsty, it was a really great discussion. So I know we only have a very short amount of time, but I just wanted to describe some of the work we're doing at Anthropocene in terms of helping people understand nuclear better. So one is the recently released Eco-America survey on nuclear perceptions, which show that people are in favor of nuclear as a solution to climate change. And the number of people who are supportive have been growing on both sides of the political spectrum. Second is an app that we've been creating called Got Nuclear. It's partly inspired by some of the earlier work that James Hansen has done to point out how many people's lives have been saved by the pollution averted by nuclear power plants. So our numbers are based on some of the current assumptions, and so we welcome any comments, feedback from the audience. So this is first draft, and so we hope to keep improving on that. And finally, just a shout out to the Spaceship One team. So this is an effort within Anthropocene to engage the public on issues related to climate change, health, numeracy, and particularly issues related to nuclear and some of the global challenges that we've been involved in. So with that, thank you so much. I want to turn it back to Jason.
Thanks, Frank. Sounds like exciting times for the Anthropocene Institute. So great. Couple of things before we go. First, be sure to take a look at the chat. We just posted the post-event survey. We'd love to hear your thoughts about today's events so that we can make better for future. Also, again, we're going to stop recording soon, but feel free to hang around for another 15 or 20 minutes for breakout session networking amongst each other in groups of 4 or 5. Our event is going to be recorded, as I mentioned, and will be rebroadcast on the EarthX TV network sometime in December. And finally, for those of us in the AirMiners Slack community, announcing that we are going to host our first ever year-end awards show called the Carbies. So for those of us on the in the AirMiners community on Slack, keep your eyes open for an announcement about how to register nominations. That should be going out very shortly today. So with that, thank you, everyone. We're going to stop recording. We're going to hang on in the Zoom meeting, and happy to break us all into networking group sessions shortly. So with that, have a great day.